This is the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region of China. If it were an independent country, it would be the world's 25th largest, with an area of over 1 million square kilometers. Its total population, on the other hand, is no larger than the city of Shanghai, making it less densely populated than even Chile or Sweden. Yet, despite its emptiness, this Mongolian steppe is the image of globalization. Arguably, no less so than bustling ports, giant container ships, or far-flung McDonald's. In all likelihood, some piece of the phone, computer, or television you're watching this video on originated here, in Baotou. More specifically, in this exact mine. What it produces are called rare earths, a group of 17 elements on the periodic table. Because of their chemical properties, some are magnetic, some especially conductive, and others corrosive, they're used to make everything from consumer electronics to the most advanced military technology. Neodymium, for instance, is used to make speakers. Lanthanum to refine petroleum. 427 kilograms, or nearly 1,000 pounds, go into a single F-35. 4 metric tons are needed to build a nuclear submarine. In 2016, 2/3 of Department of Defense vendors reported importing at least one rare earth element. They're sometimes referred to as technology's vitamins. You don't need a lot of them, but you do absolutely need them. In other words, nearly every last satellite, laser, fiber optic cable, superconductor, missile guidance system, DVD player, fuel cell, car, drone, bomb, hard drive, phone, you name it, relies on this remote mining town in Inner Mongolia. It's the foundation upon which the entire modern world depends, a forgotten, hidden away, but essential organ of the global economy. In the words of one scholar, this issue has the potential to bring down America. American prosperity and stability may well hang in the balance of this issue. In hindsight, it's easy to see how we got here. First, China recognized, decades before anyone else, the strategic value of rare earths. Like Huawei and telecommunications, the government nurtured the industry with protectionist laws and preferential investment. Next, because of what were effectively state subsidies, Chinese state-owned enterprises could price their rare earths below market rates. And finally, other companies were slowly forced to declare bankruptcy or move their operations to China, right in the hands of the CCP. Here you can see the production of rare earth elements over time. This is the United States, this is the rest of the world, and this is China. At the peak of its dominance in 2010, it controlled 97% of the global supply. Today, that number is still a staggering 60%. It all happened while we weren't paying attention, and by the time we realized, it was too late. Surely it can't be a coincidence that America's greatest strategic competitor has had, at various times, a virtual monopoly on the parts required to make its most advanced fighter jet. Indeed, in 1992, Deng Xiaoping proclaimed, quote, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." And if that doesn't confirm a grand strategy emanating from the very top of the Communist Party, there's more. In September 2010, a Japanese Coast Guard ship was patrolling disputed waters around the Senkaku Islands when it discovered several Chinese fishing boats. After they were ordered to leave the area, one began ramming into the Japanese cutter. A chase ensued and Coast Guard officials arrested the captain, who they allege was drunk, and detained him for several weeks. Soon afterward, Japan, the second largest importer of rare earths, was cut off from their supply by China. Now, I've been seeing headlines about China's rare earth dominance for years. I never really looked into it because it seemed so cut and dry. There was motive, there seemed to be evidence, and I just didn't have much to add. But after hearing it described over and over again as China's trump card, its secret weapon to defeat America, it started to sound a bit too perfect. It reminded me of something else. the Belt and Road debt trap narrative, a myth we dispelled in this earlier episode. It would require half a century of strategy and foresight, spanning multiple generations of Chinese leaders. As we discussed in that video about the Belt and Road Initiative, and this one about so-called Chinese efficiency, there's a temptation to attribute everything the country does to some grand plan, to resort to stereotypes about Chinese people thinking 50 years ahead. Like the idea of China imprisoning entire continents in debt for leverage, the story of its rare earth dominance feels narratively irresistible, which made me suspicious. So I finally dug deeper. It didn't take long to unravel the first major myth. It turns out rare earths aren't actually rare, not even a little bit. As you can see here, massive reserves have also been discovered in Brazil, Vietnam, Russia, and India. But even this image undersells their ubiquity. Visualizing these reserves as slices of a pie disguises how big the pie is in the first place. Sure, 36% are located in China, but saying that implies a scarcity that simply doesn't exist. A better way is to look at a map of all known deposits. Most countries have enough to be self-sufficient. The US alone has enough supply for roughly a century. A few elements are genuinely hard to find. Promethium, for example, is virtually absent in nature and has to be created in a lab. Fortunately, it's only needed for a few specific applications, like nuclear batteries for guided missiles. Most, however, are abundant in the Earth's crust. There's as much naturally occurring cerium as there is copper. The only reason they're called rare is scientific ignorance at the time of their discovery, 1788. But if they're so common, you might be thinking, why does just one mine in China produce the vast majority? Well, I had the same question, and in search of an answer, I discovered this book by Dr. Julie Michelle Klinger. As it turns out, the development of that mine, called Bayan Obo, was motivated by politics, though not in the way you might think. Although it began operation way back in the 1920s, it took on new importance after the People's Republic was founded in 1949. A year later, China signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. China recognized the independence of Mongolia, or Outer Mongolia as it was sometimes referred, which was then a Soviet satellite state. But it was concerned about a pan-Mongolian independence movement gaining traction in its own Inner Mongolia region. Its solution was to assert its sovereignty and incorporate Inner Mongolia into the rest of the country by developing its economy. This also meant encouraging Han Chinese immigration to the region and reducing the ratio of ethnic Mongolians in a horrific genocidal campaign. China, lacking the technology required to actually refine and process materials like rare earths, enlisted its new friend, the Soviet Union, for help. In exchange, it received special access to those resources. Situated between the two countries, Inner Mongolia seemed like the perfect place to build and supply their militaries. It was here, in Baotou, that China later built nuclear weapons. In other words, the country's dominance over rare earths began not as a grand strategic plan so much as historical happenstance, as a byproduct of preventing Mongolian independence and as part of the modernization of its military. But it wasn't just China's actions alone. The US also had a hand in this. As late as the early 1980s, it was America, not China, that dominated rare earths. Before Bayan Obo, there was the Mountain Pass mine on the California-Nevada border, which produced 70% of the global supply. In fact, two American companies controlled nearly the entire rare earth supply chain for 50 years. All that changed largely thanks to one man, Edward Nixon, Richard Nixon's younger brother. Edward Nixon lobbied for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which significantly increased scrutiny of rare earth mines, a notoriously dirty industry. Mineable deposits are interwoven with uranium, fluoride, arsenic, and a handful of other toxic and radioactive elements. Separating the desired elements from these hazardous ones requires dipping them repeatedly in acid, which produces toxic leftover wastewater. That wastewater, called tailings, is then dumped into a nearby dam, where it sits, with any luck, forever, undisturbed by earthquakes or flooding. Workers and nearby residents contend with higher rates of cancer, birth defects, and organ damage. The EPA discovered a total of 60 wastewater spills containing toxic concentrations of lead and radium between 1984 and 98. Some of these spills occurred near the Mojave National Preserve. Meanwhile, just as American mining was becoming increasingly difficult and costly, China began offering financial incentives and subsidies in 1985. Edward Nixon began approaching American mining companies, suggesting it would be far cheaper to ship their ore overseas for processing. And just like that, production slowly moved to China, where these social and environmental costs were outsourced. And it was all instigated by the president's own brother. Now, this was beginning to change in the early 2000s. The cancer mortality rate in Baotou grew from 107 per 100,000 people in 1989 to 155 by 1997, over 7 times the average for Western China. Residents could be distinguished from visitors by their visible skin lesions and decaying teeth. In addition to these social and environmental costs, the Chinese government also had a goal in the early 2000s to climb the value chain. As it grew richer, the time had come for it, like the United States 2 or 3 decades earlier, to offload the problem onto someone else. In '99, it introduced a quota on rare earth exports. 5 years later, it eliminated financial incentives to produce them, and in 2006, it announced a tariff. It was in the midst of a slow transition. Then the 2010 incident happened. It's true that a Chinese fishing boat intentionally crashed into the Japanese Coast Guard, that the captain was arrested, and Japan saw a decrease in rare earth imports from China shortly after. But that's not the whole story. We, as outsiders, tend to imagine the Chinese government as a single monolithic entity, and underestimate how many decisions are made by individuals at lower levels. The arrest of the Chinese captain was played domestically as a declaration of war by Japan, a national humiliation. Anti-Japanese protests were so disorderly that they often clashed with police. The rare earth blockade, as it's often called, wasn't a central government directive. Rather, it was orchestrated by a few angry military personnel and customs officers in a port city. When Japan confronted China about the disruption, central authorities were caught off guard. It took weeks before they were able to fully resume shipments. Much like we learned in this video, it was a case of local government discretion, and the inability of the central government to contain the nationalism that it itself stokes. All this context was lost on the media, who presented the story as a clear-cut case of retaliation. Prices for rare earths skyrocketed to levels never before seen. And although this was caused by market speculation and not reality, the effects were very real. Some companies saw their profits fall by as much as 35% in 2010. Many forms of green energy became economically infeasible overnight. It was a huge wake-up call for the industry and for the world. Partly in response to this, the US and several other countries filed a dispute with the World Trade Organization, which it won, forcing China to remove all export quotas in 2015. Ironically, removing the quotas led to an increase in supply, driving down prices, and preventing anyone else from competing with China. Remember, China was in the process of reducing its production of rare earths. By forcing it to drop its restrictions, the US significantly delayed the industry's diversification. Presidents Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Senator Ted Cruz have all made efforts to revitalize US production. After 2010, California's Mountain Pass mine received a $1.5 billion investment, but it was forced to declare bankruptcy after prices fell in 2015. So, could China follow through on its threats and use its monopoly as leverage against, say, the US? Absolutely, and it wouldn't be the first time it's transparently broken free trade principles. But it would be mutually assured destruction. First, rare earth elements aren't sent directly from China to America. They're mostly used to produce electronics in countries like Japan and South Korea. An effective embargo, therefore, would cause significant collateral damage. It would also mean the loss of thousands or even millions of domestic jobs. Plus, it's a weapon you can really only deploy once. The rest of the world could replace China's output in under a year, after which it would never return to its current level of dependence. Useful as it may be as a threat, to actually use it would truly be a last resort. This should sound familiar. It's essentially the story of globalization. The world doesn't need China to build our iPhones. We've chosen the country for simple economic reasons. It's cheaper. And we're unwilling to make the necessary social and environmental sacrifices at home. Obviously, it's less than ideal for any one country to monopolize the production of rare earths. But with prices so low and the amount of sustained effort required to change the status quo so high, there's just no sense of urgency. For all the many genuine concerns about our dependence on China, rare earths just aren't very high on the list. Consider the fact that all our hysteria, skepticism, and fear is directed at one of the ways China has actually enabled our modern world. Its state subsidies led to the low prices which made the entire technological revolution possible. Deng Xiaoping's quote from earlier came a year after the Gulf War. It was intended as a warning that China could be exploited for its resources, not as a declaration of some grand strategy. And unlike rare earths, our collective supply of time, attention, and concern are scarce. We should be directing our attention toward the real threats.